I'm Dave Adams and you are watching The Core Mechanic. Today I am looking at number 99 on Mike Selinker's list of 100 games you absolutely, positively must know how to play the game. By the way, you just lost the game. Sorry. For those of you who don't know, the game is somewhat of a different style of game. In fact, this fits into the creative category games on the list, and Mike Selinker doesn't make too much of a bones about it. He just has it up there as something fun to do, but it's kind of hard to explain in terms of its purpose or its function, or even if it's really a game. Now, the rules of the game are simple. If you think about the game, you've lost the game. However, if you stop thinking about the game, you're not losing the game. And that's where the difficulty comes in, because normally in a game state there is some sort of objective where you can win the game, but in this no one wins the game. In fact, most people aren't even aware that they're playing it, which is okay, and it's in some senses it's even better, because not knowing that you're part of the game means that you've got a higher chance of not losing until you find out that you are part of the game, at which point you've lost the game. So the only objective is to not think of the game, and this became hugely popular around the year 2000. It's really not clear where it came from, what its origins are. There's some semblances of ideas, but not a lot, and nothing terribly clear. And one of the things to consider is that everybody is technically playing the game, even if they don't want to play the game. Once you find out you're playing the game, you've lost the game. I myself found out from students who came up and commented that I just lost the game. As soon as I worked out what they were talking about and spoke to them and found out about the game, I didn't really care for it. It was one of those silly, childish student things, until someone later mentioned the word game, and in my head I said, damn, I've just lost the game. From there it's become one of those sort of things that just becomes a part of the everyday. Occasionally, not all the time, but just occasionally, it'll occur to me that I've just lost the game. So it does seem a bit odd to have this on the list. However, I think there's perhaps something we can get out of this. And that kind of raises the question then of, well, what is it? At the end of the talk on the game, Mike gives a bit of a clue as to what he thinks it is when he says, now that I've told you about it, you can go out and infect others. And many people seem to refer to the game as a mental virus. And a mental virus is essentially bits of culture that are passed on from person to person, either verbally or through repeated actions. In a sense, what this is a meme that is an element of culture that has been subsumed into culture and transmuted through participation in the culture. So that kind of says what it is. But how does it work? And I think this most closely links to a concept in psychology called ironic process theory, or white bear theory. Ironic process theory refers to the psychological process of trying to suppress a thought only for that thought to become more dominant. The reason it's called white bear theory is in reference to Dostoevsky's Winter Notes on Summer Impressions, where he says, try to pose for yourself this problem. Try not to think of a polar bear, and you'll be sure that the darn thing will come to mind every minute. Now, I didn't get that word for word, but that's approximately what he says. And the idea is that every time you try to suppress an idea in your head, the likelihood is that it's going to become more prominent or more prevalent. So if I said to you, try not to think of an elephant, immediately your brain is going to think of an elephant. Now, this actually has some real-world applications. When we consider people with OCD, for instance, we're looking at people, or people of a similar vein, with issues of getting trapped on thoughts or trapped in ways of thinking. The issue is that they can't actually suppress certain thoughts, or they can't move on or find a way to deflect away from certain ways of thinking. Usually those thoughts are connected with their sense of impermanence in the world. And so these thoughts keep festering, and as they try to suppress them, they become more dominant. Now, the area of psychology known as acceptance and commitment therapies actually picks up on this idea and acknowledges that it's impossible to suppress thoughts, and instead it's better to simply acknowledge bad thinking. In fact, they go on to say that you will naturally have negative thoughts regularly throughout the day. And so instead of trying to not think about it or trying to block those thoughts out, the better option is to simply acknowledge them and to take on a certain objectivity to them. Now, that just becomes helpful not just for people with stronger conditions like OCD, but just for everyday getting through life, where we're maybe feeling overly stressed about particular relationship situations, or we're feeling particularly concerned about business or work life, or any such stress-related circumstance. Now, the other area that this ironic process theory comes under or has some relationship to is with memorization or memetics, which is the process of trying to remember or strategies for remembering. And one of the reasons being is that the issue of suppressing thoughts actually brings them to mind, but that's something that's curious for people when we struggle to remember things regularly, that the moment we try to suppress it, it comes to the fore. And so it's become part of the field of study. In fact, it's led into a lot of different ways of trying to understand the brain, because in general, we're not very good with remembering things, or we're not very good at curating information in the brain. Now, one of the things that help us with memory and with thinking and processing is a way of organizing our brains, and that's the concept of classification. One of the significant features of humanity is our desire to classify things. Now, modern science is stating that our need to classify things is almost an evolutionary necessity. The fact that we do classify things on such a level is almost nonsensical. There's absolutely no reason for us to classify every form of string bean, and yet we will have any number of forms of string bean around, or orchids, or any number of a similar plant with a plethora of different names for each variety and each different nuance that we find. In fact, the scientists say that our brains get a dose of endorphins every time we discover something new. Our brains are literally rewarding us for learning constantly, and classification is one of the ways in which we do that. In fact, some of the things they've found in terms of on a historical level is that as cultures developed and grew, the way they classified was profoundly similar across different cultures. For instance, as we were forming words and coming up with classifications, one of the first classifications each culture came up with was the classification of human and non-human. But then it also went into this bizarre thing where the very next classification was very similar across all cultures, where we'd come up with a classification for either bird or snake. Adding on to that was when we got to colors and started coming up with classifications of colors, each culture almost universally came up with the color for red before it came up with any other color. But the very next set of colors it came up with was either blue or green, and if it didn't come up with blue first, then it would come up with green first. It's almost this universal thing that's going on inside our heads where we need to classify. There's this evolutionary drive to classify, even though there is no real, or at least logical reason for us to be so particular about our classifications. But what we do find is that this is all part of helping to create an organized mind. It creates patterns for us to work from, to think from, and to develop new strategies of understanding the world around us, and it actually empowers us to think differently about the world. So in terms of being able to work with my player base, going back to those thoughts on classification even, game mechanics are forms of classification that we can use, and being able to have identifiable ways for my players to enter into the game and for their brains to pick up and feel comfortable and at home with the game, I want to be able to trigger on those elements that are familiar to them. I'm talking about intuitive design. Intuitive design is those games when we can pick them up and we say, oh yeah, that makes sense, or I can fit into that. We can get into the game and get active and engaged in the game straight away. When I was pulling out the game Cry Havoc and trying to read through the rules, I was sitting there with Ricky, and Ricky was setting the board up as I read out the setup practice, and he was doing things before I even got there and then telling me what the next line of the text would probably be and getting it pretty spot on, like almost to the word. And I was baffled by this, but when I looked down at the board and saw how it was set up and how it was designed, a lot of it just made sense. It was beautifully set out and clear where different factions would go, how they would operate, what went where, how you would track different parts of the game. It was brilliantly intuitive, and playing the game just made so much sense. In a sense, it brought together several, I suppose, memes in a gaming sense, things, patterns or ways of working that I was very familiar with. It had an element of deck building games where I would have a deck of cards and I'd use that almost Dominion style of play where I would draw my cards, use what was in my hand, and then draw back up, and then use the discard pile, reshuffle it to form my deck again. I'd had a bit of drafting where I could draft from different cards from the board to improve my hand or work on my hand. It had area control. All of these things are known, reliable gaming mechanics that have certain forms and features to them that we're very familiar with. Now, occasionally you get games that try to play with those features, and the success of that, and the success of whether they're intuitive or not, is how well they pick up on that patterning within my brain of my experiences with those mechanics and gives me access to understanding the game and playing and engaging more fully. So in terms of being a designer and thinking intuitively, one of the things I want to do is to try and, as much as I want to bring creativity, I also want to be able to pick up on those well-worn, those well-worked through patterns of understanding so that my players can easily and naturally sink into the game. That also will give me, as I become better able at understanding the classifications of these mechanics and how they work, will give me the ability to stretch and move my player base beyond just the simple or the simplistic nature of those mechanics to push them to something new. Now look, I know that that's a bit of an in-depth look at what was probably just a fun creative game thrown on there, that the game itself. But I hope you enjoyed it. I hope I took you on a bit of a journey and maybe elaborated on this concept. It's why I wanted to include it and not just leave it out, was that I actually think there are some interesting thought experiments or learnings we can take from the game. I hope you've had fun. If you liked what I've done, please hit that like button. If you're new here, please hit that subscribe button. Until next time, my name's Dave Adams, and this is The Core Mechanic.